President Biden just signed an executive order that directed that U.S. soldiers on the ground in Ukraine be paid hazard pay, in other words, combat pay. Well, he's been telling us that there are no U.S. soldiers on the ground in Western Ukraine. Well, we know that's not true, just as we know there are many soldiers from many NATO nations on the ground in Western Ukraine. It's a very dangerous thing, though, to signal this publicly and make this public statement, because it conveys the impression to Moscow that we're actually contemplating intervention there. My concern with the Polish and Lithuanian connection is that if they go in there, they will be attacked. Putin has made that very clear. He said, well, yes, if they come into Western Ukraine, they will never leave. We will make sure they never leave. In other words, they'll be buried there. Well, I think the Poles and Ukrainians mistakenly believe that if that happens, that we will then send our forces in to help them. Now, maybe someone in Washington is prepared to do that I don't know. I know that the senior military leadership in Washington is very fearful of that. But it may be that the political leaders in Washington don't think that's the risky alternative to watching Ukraine collapse. They may say, well, if we don't go in some fashion to help the Poles, our credibility will be completely gone. NATO will collapse. And that takes us back to your opening question. What about NATO over the long run? And I think NATO's doomed, because NATO consists of 32 nations now? Every nation has a different set of interests. Not all of those nations see the world through the same lens as people in Washington and Brussels and in Berlin or Oslo. In other words, the world looks very different depending upon where you stand. And trying to drag NATO into this could absolutely end it quickly. And I don't think Washington believes that. I think, again, they look at the sheepish behavior of the ruling elites in Europe and say, well, these people have no choice, but they have to go along with this anyway. Well, perhaps that's true for the globalists that are running your countries, but that's not necessarily true for the people that live in Europe. And I think the European electorates see things differently. In other words, I don't have crystal clear picture of what is going to happen. What I do know is that officers who've sat in on meetings and tried to explain the true situation and point to the dramatic increase in Russian military power and the excellent performance of Russian forces are not welcome as discussants in these meetings. If you want to be on the inside, if you want to be with the four stars and the politicians, you have to talk about, oh, these Ukrainians are going to win. These Russians are just stupid. They can't do anything right. And if they come up against NATO forces, they're doomed. Well, that's a lot of nonsense to make those kinds of statements, but that's more popular than I think is healthy for our governments right now.
But you mentioned before that the Russians haven't had their major offensive yet. And I was curious why we haven't seen it, because, well, I do understand it's a war of attrition and it shouldn't merely be measured in territory, but also loss of troops. But on the other hand, we see that the Russians have mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They're armed to the teeth. And on the other side, we see that they have degraded the Ukrainian military to a great extent, even emptied NATO's weapon storages, by which we are now admitting as well. So as a military man and a scholar in this, why do you think Russia hasn't gone for these big arrows yet?
I think that President Putin remains cautious because he does not want to precipitate a direct confrontation with NATO and the United States. That's always been his top concern. But I think he's got plenty of senior officers who are telling him, look, if we continue to wait this way, people will misinterpret our restraint for weakness, and they will think that they can exploit this weakness. And I think the senior officers in the senior ranks of the Russian military who are saying that are correct. You cannot win any war by sitting on the defensive. It can't be done. You can kill almost everybody in front of you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can win. And I think increasingly the view in the senior ranks of the Russian side is that until we're moving down the main streets of Kiev and our forces have crossed the Dnieper River, no one is going to believe the war is really over. In other words, they won't believe that we've won it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So the danger right now is too much Russian restraint. And if it continues, I think it will invite Polish and Lithuanian intervention. And then that is Pandora's box. God help all of us. The consequences of that are profound.
I heard this argument from people such as Michael McFaul suggesting that if America only steps up and enters, then the Russians would be too fearful and bow down. And this is also something I heard from Moscow, which is that they have two risks. One, yes, if they hit back, they risk war with NATO. On the other hand, the risk of not hitting back is becoming much greater because as they see, the emboldens the adversary to think in the ways that McFaul is thinking, that if they only roll across the border, then they would run away. So for them, it seems to be a bit of a dilemma. Avoiding big war, but on the other hand, don't have this restraint misunderstood as a weakness.
Remember, the Russians have also, and I think Putin deserves a lot of credit for this, have also been very sensitive to the opinions of people in the global South, not just China and India, but also the global South. And he has not wanted them to think that he was someone who would dismiss the humanitarian dimensions of the war, and he hasn't. In other words, he's tried to make it very clear that his approach to this whole thing is more defensive than offensive, that this is something Russia doesn't want, has never really wanted, and is doing because it had no alternative. But at the same time, this is interpreted in the West as weakness. And I think the Russians know that. And I have a feeling that they're waiting to see what the Poles and Lithuanians do. And if they are foolish enough to intervene, I suspect at that point, the great avalanche of Russian military power will fall on Ukraine and potentially Poland and Lithuania. Because if they think they're going to be treated with immunity, that's not going to work. If they go into Ukraine, their countries let's put it this way, it will be open season on them for the Russians.
Well, let's say, be optimistic that we all decide after 1.5 years of this horrible war that we have to pursue a political settlement. Well, at this point, what do you think it could look like? I know, previously neutrality would have been enough, but after 1.5 years of this fighting, the Russians not going to give up any of the territory. So what could be a possible agreement look like, do you think? What concessions would be able to get from the Russians, and what would NATO and Ukraine be willing to give?
Well, first of all, the Russians don't want Western Ukraine. They don't want to annex areas that are fundamentally Ukrainian. They've never made that statement. They've always wanted to avoid that. They're not fools. They know that's sort of like putting a poison apple in your basket and then subsequently trying to eat it. They're not interested in that. I think if you sat down with them, they would tell you that what they have right now, which is historically Russian and is where the Russian population largely lives, they're going to retain. The question is, what do you do with Odessa and what do you do with Kharkov? I think Odessa is going to be a tough one because terrible things were done to Russian citizens in Odessa in 2014, as you know. But even more important, Odessa has been used over the last year plus as a point from which you could unload weapons and equipment for the Ukrainian military from empty ships that then picked up grain and went to sea. The Russians said no more. And they will not tolerate any control by the United States and its allies of anything in the Black Sea. So if we go into the Black Sea with any ships from the U.S. Navy or Royal Navy, which I think would be lunacy, frankly, they'll sink them without hesitation. So no, I think that's the real conundrum. You hold what you've got, and then the question is what happens with Kharkov and Odessa. There could be some inventive solutions applied to Odessa, that it's fully demilitarized. It sort of ends up in a status very similar to Danzig as a free city. Who knows? Kharkov's another question. Maybe the Russians don't want it simply because they say, well, even though it was Russian speaking, they may not really want the bill for rebuilding it. I don't know. We don't know until you sit down and talk with the Russians. But on the Ukrainian side, whatever remains of Ukraine has to be neutral. There's no question about that. There can be no NATO